Hello, everyone. Welcome to the stream. Today we're talking about strength in TTRPGs, and I'm super excited for this. Got a lot of comments, a lot of feedback on the last video, and it was a good time, and I enjoyed talking about this. And I know that there's some that wanted to follow up with it, wanted to talk about it more. So here we are. I hope that everybody who saw that video and wanted to comment gets the comment on this one and gets to join the live stream. We'll be going for about 2 hours here, and then or maybe hour and a half, and then we'll move on to something else. So yeah, we'll just kind of jump into it. I do have I was gonna have someone joining me, so I do have some of his. Unfortunately, something came up. He wasn't able to join. A friend of mine who has some intelligent things to say about this. So he did leave me some notes. I do have those here, and then I have my own notes. We're gonna kind of walk through it. And what I've got today is some of there's definitely some common threads in the comment section from folks, and there were obviously, it's the internet. There's some folks that have opinions about things that maybe they know less about. So those are honestly just fun. Like I'm not, I'm not trying to give anybody a hard time, but yeah, we'll talk about it. And yeah, we'll just start off. But one of the reasons for that video, the whole strength in TTRPGs, besides the fact that it's just kind of a fun topic, I think what most people want is some sort of semblance of a reality, but also at least internally consistent. Some people were like, oh, you want something that's externally consistent. And I actually feel that way as well. I think what we reference most things by are what we know in our real life. And one of the problems with a lot of TTRPGs and strength in them is that you want fantasy fulfillment. That's what it's really all about, right? So if I make a big strong character, I want them to feel big and strong. And if somebody has a weak wizard or even an average strength wizard, what does that look like, and does my character feel appropriately stronger? Now, and as I go through this, guys, drop comments here, please. I would love to hear what everybody has to say. If you have questions or whatever you want to get in here, please drop it. And then in the background here, just as an FYI, I found this video today and I thought it was interesting. So it's only like 4 minutes long, or 3 minutes long. So we might take a look here. But, that's what we all want, is that fantasy fulfillment. We want to feel like our character, is the kind of character that we try to make. And hey, Lyriel, how's it going? So, that's what we want. And that's the issue and where this stuff comes up. Now, a few people pointed out, rightly so, that when you talk about Dungeons and Dragons 5e currently, whenever you go up to like 30 strength, you're talking about dragons and what have you, like real life elephants are stronger than that. And I might be a little bit off there, but I'm pretty sure that's right. Either way, there are animals that are stronger than giant mythical dragons and deities and what have you in D&D. And one of the problems you face, or rather TTRPG creators face, is that yeah, in D&D elephants are stronger than dragons. The basic lift does not go up that high, Lyriel. But one of the issues you have is that in real life, if you're 125 pounds and somebody else is 250 pounds, and you're both of average build for your size, for your weight or what have you, the person who's 125 pounds can't really do much, if anything, to the person who's 250 pounds. And that's a big enough weight and strength difference that if you swung something at somebody who was that much larger than you, they could probably just grab it. And and like there's not really much you could do. Now, we see this in movies too all the time, right? I'm off the top of my head, I'm thinking of like John Wick, and you have like Halle Berry, and she's really small. I don't know how small. I guess we could probably Google it or whatever. But hey, what's going up, Dank? Actually, I'm like curious now. Can we just like, yeah, how tall is I don't know, how do you spell Halle Berry? Is it Berry? Is that how you spell it? I have no idea. We'll see. I'm guessing she's like 5'5". There we go. Right, you see her in plenty of movies. I think she was an X-Men as well. Just picking someone randomly here. There's not much Halle Berry can really do to anybody, and they do some really cool things where she's doing some crazy, grappling and stuff like that. It's fun. We like it. I want that in my TTRPGs. Totally good with that. The thing is, if you make things too realistic, that's just not possible. And the other thing is when you talk about mass as well, when people are trying to get shoved over, this is one of my oh, it's Grits. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. I just saw Dink. Cool, Grits. I'm glad you can make it, man. Hey, Grits, feel free to drop any comments or whatever stuff you want to talk about. I'm kind of talking about some stuff, but we can jump over to it in a few. If Dr. Dank PhD, I just took the time to read all of that. I like it. Yeah. So that is a problem, right? We don't want that kind of realism. And what a few people pointed out, or rather a few comments, I think one comment, and then there's a few people that jumped on there, are like, this is not simulationist and this is not realistic because, men in real life are stronger than women. The thing is, what's the point of that? Is my question. Yeah, that there are differences in men and women in strength. That's absolutely a thing. IRL, what fantasy is this fulfilling for you in your TTRPG? And if you ask yourself that question and spend some time thinking about it, if you feel strongly about this, you might come up with some interesting answers and some introspection that could be helpful for you. But I would argue that there's really not anything that adds. And so we've done away with that. And, it's not really, fun, right? I'm very Caucasian. Okay. I could use some melanin. I really could. If I go outside, I will burn. If it doesn't matter if it's a cloudy day or whatever, I will burn fairly rapidly unless I slather up with sunscreen. I don't want to have to deal with putting on sunscreen in my TTRPG. Okay. I don't need some, magical salve from the local alchemist to keep my character from burning in the sun. Right. That's the kind of realism we just don't need. There's some stuff where it's like, yeah, this doesn't really make sense. And I think it's the same way when you compare strength with the various, male and female and what have you. So, I just don't think there's anything that it's adding of value. So I don't really think we need it. So let's move on and kind of talk about. I think we've. So the problem is we're looking for realism. The problem is I think all of us want that fantasy fulfillment. We want things to be interesting, and then there are a lot of solutions to that. I think the main thing when you're looking for strength, when you're talking about this, is we need some sort of there are critical points. Okay, there are critical points where your strength goes from this is normal, and then this is maybe the top end of what a normal human can achieve. And then, maybe there are other levels depending on what kind of game you're playing. If you're playing supers, that goes crazy high. If you're talking about like vampires and werewolves, those things are always known to be more strong. And so they are going to, you need a different scale maybe for that. Or maybe you say, oh, well, they're the strongest human, what have you. So, there's some sort of scale. And then I think the idea is that you need something to either fit that curve, and depending on your level of crunch. As a couple people pointed out, if you're talking about something like Vampire the Masquerade or Werewolf, it's the same system. It's strength 1 through 5 is like normal people. And then above that, you start getting to the extraordinary or what have you. And it actually makes it where even with only 5 levels, or, if you want to go up to 10 or whatever, when you're talking about extraordinary creatures, you are looking at essentially like it fulfills the role you want it to. The 1 point up in strength is a big deal in that system, and that is okay. And then if you go with something with more crunch, that's also fine. Hey, Shot, what's going on? Shrink should count towards charisma checks if you're buff and sexy. High charisma with low strength would be a pudgy stand-up comedian type. Yeah, well, and high strength with low charisma would be like a power lifter, right? So I think that those are fine being separate. That's actually a good point. How we separate these things. That was something else that was brought up is when you, and I know somewhat you're just making a joke, but when you talk about, apparently some people have problems figuring out strength versus dexterity. And I actually think that this halfling strength video that I found earlier is going to really help us with that. And we're going to see how that interaction matters and what it actually means. Some systems, Shot says some systems use multiple attribute checks. You weren't joking at all. Okay, well, I don't think that strength. So if you have charisma, right, that's how people react to you. Having that would be like, well, do all of the attributes affect all of the other attributes? How would you do that as far as a mechanical thing? I don't think that there's a great like sure, maybe it's a good idea. I'm not saying it's not a good idea, but I don't know how you would practically do that. Where, because you could argue to no end that, oh, well, my wisdom, if somebody's, attracted to intelligence, then my intelligence should certainly add to my charisma. And I think you could do that in play, but I don't think you would actually add that to your attributes. It would be kind of odd. And I think those different things are kind of how you define your character. If you are, as you said, someone with high charisma but low strength, you could be. Yeah, I mean, I don't think the character has to be pudgy, I suppose, but you could be any number of things. So yeah, I'm not really sure. I'd be curious what you have to say about that. So we should actually, speaking of, let's get into some of the comments that we got this that I've kind of added together here, and I'm not actually going to read the comments specifically, but I'm going to address some of the issues that people brought up. One of the things is that I think I have here actually a picture of what I think most people view as the average farmer. Um, this might sear your eyes. Are you ready for it? Let me see here. Yeah, I think the average farmer on the older side looks like this to most folks. And I know this is just some AI slop that I Googled, but yeah, this is what most people think the average farmer looks like. There might be a few other, we got some AI images here. Again, I just Googled this, and this is some of the stuff that popped up. Here you go. Yeah, dude's got muscles on top of muscles. The thing with, I don't know if I should leave this up, it's going to sear people's eyes. But this is really what most people seem to think what the average farmer looks like. And I had comments about like, oh, if you had plowed, if you worked in a urban environment or in a rural environment rather. I actually grew up in the country. I grew up in a rural area. I have someone mentioned like, oh, if you had plowed a field by hand. I've plowed a field by hand. I was a bit of a troubled youth, and in those areas, manual labor is considered like good for the soul and something that'll straighten you right out. So I've actually done all those things, and lifting weights is what got me, on the larger side, not doing farmer work. What will happen if you're lifting 60 or 80 pound hay bales all day long, which is only part of the time, like it's not something you're constantly doing, depending on what you're doing. But that's a good example of lifting something heavy. What you'll get good at is lifting 60 or 80 pound hay bales, and you'll get more efficient at it. And that's typically what you see both IRL, like you can go look and historically, like you can go, see that people adapt to lifting something. It doesn't mean that their overall strength suddenly goes up or that they're good at doing everything else. The other thing is if you're going to continue to get stronger, you have to continually lift more weights. So what I mean by that is you have to keep like increasing the weight. And if you're only lifting the same weight of hay bale, you're going to get really good and more efficient, and your endurance is going to go up. And I think this is one of those things that people were kind of confusing and getting convoluted, is that endurance is not the same as strength and how these things apply. Now, we kind of divide muscles into two types, like fast and slow twitch. Basically, muscles that are fast twitch are good at lifting a lot of weight, but they get fatigued very easily. Other muscles are not as good as lifting as much weight. However, they last a lot longer. So think endurance runners versus, strength athletes versus, or sprinters perhaps. And so those two things, they're a bit, there's a trade-off in those. What happens in one way you could deal with strength if you wanted to deal with like fatigue and what have you is actually similar to what Start Here does, where whenever you roll against an attribute and you can take damage to that attribute. And I actually think that could be a really interesting and good way to explain fatigue, where your strength actually goes down as you lift heavier things. So maybe you roll, and if you succeed on your strength check, your strength doesn't go down because you've got enough strength for it. But if you've been hiking and everything all day long, maybe when you roll against your strength to see if you succeed, you also are rolling to see if your strength goes down from fatigue. And maybe you get minuses to that roll if you've been out hiking all day and what have you. But the idea that a farmer, a lot of people would just think that, they have this view of the past that everybody was stronger and more fit and what have you. And sure, that's true to some extent. However, we sit currently, like people were like, oh, Americans or, people in general are more sedentary. We actually sit about the same as more tribal people that are, living in non-developed places. And we know that. However, our overall activity is indeed lower in the times that we're not sitting. but there's no real basis for saying that, yeah, people were just incredibly stronger. Nutrition plays a huge part in this. A lot of people, if you don't have enough protein, it doesn't matter how much weight you lift, you're not like you're going to lose muscle if you don't have enough protein. So that's huge. People have gained heights. The other thing is really interesting too is I don't think that there are meaningful averages out there. Whenever you look at so the Mayan people, and they still exist today, they're still around, the average height is 5 foot tall. The women a couple inches shorter, men typically 5'2", women 5'10". In the US, that would be short enough. It has been in the past where you would qualify for disability. And the reason for that is because a lot of things are not, it's hard to perform certain jobs because things are not made for someone of that height because it's so outside of the norm for our culture. Whenever you look at Vikings, and which are historically, larger people, even, currently, the average height in the U.S. is like 5'9", and they were 5'9", several hundred years ago. The other thing is that height over time has done a little bit of a yo-yo depending on where you're at. Now the average height, I believe, is 5'11" in most Nordic countries. And so, the difference between height, and I don't know if most people appreciate this, and is insane. And the amount of strength, like actual strength that you have, is way different. So I'm 5'11", a little bit over, not quite 6 foot. And I've had friends who are really jacked, huge, who were like 5'6". In practical terms, they had problems. Like if we were wrestling, I won because even though they had these massive muscles, there's leverage and other things that come into play. Now, I think this is a situation where most of us say, hey, we don't need that level of realism in our TTRPG. However, when you start talking about giants, and whether real or imagined, and you're talking about people who are 9 foot tall, the sheer strength on someone like that is insane. And the ability, again, someone who is 7 foot tall, I don't know if most people have had experience with like professional athletes and stuff like that who are of that height. It's night and day. Whenever I've had a decent amount of experience, just casually with this. Whenever a professional athlete in the U.S. who like plays a serious sport that has, and when I say serious, that should mean something with a lot of money in it, so that you get those who are genetic freaks, and they walk in and they have to duck. Right, they have to duck to walk into whatever doorway because they're, at 6'4" or what have you. You see someone who looks small on a football field, I would encourage you to do this. And you're like, oh, this looks like an average person. They're in decent shape. Look up their stats. And you might find that they're 6'2" and that they're 220 pounds of like no body fat. They're a beast. They're a monster. And that's the small person. And then you see him next to a 350-pound lineman. And you're like, oh, okay, this is a different thing. You can look up pictures of actually somebody I know and I run into sometimes. Let's see if we can find him. And I don't know if I remember how to spell Jesse Cherdak. We'll see if we can get him. Is that how he spells his name? Yeah, this handsome gentleman right here. Jesse. Jesse looks like an average guy here. He's a little bit built, right? Jesse is huge. He's both tall and wide. Okay. Jesse makes me like, you might look at us and be like, oh, we kind of are the same size. No, he's a monster and I'm not. And he's not even the biggest, right? This is someone who's in the TTRPG space, which is why I picked him, because I oftentimes see him at the airport because we both fly out of the Denver airport when going to cons. And, you look at him and it's funny. I've seen some of his Instagram posts and stuff like that where he's lifting weights and he doesn't look that impressive. In reality, he's massive. And when you see someone like this and you're actually like lifting weights next to them, their strength is on a different level. And I don't think a lot of people appreciate that. Okay, so I wanted to talk about, let's move on. So Briam, which is somebody who said that they are a powerlifting coach, and they said they coach hundreds of beginners, and the average untrained male can deadlift around 70 to 100 kilograms. Kilograms to pounds, you got to multiply by 2.25. So on the high end there, we're talking about 220 pounds. Female, a little less. Exceptionally strong men with a background in sport or heavy labor can maybe do up to 140 kilograms, and he gave a range there. That's the top end without training. Okay, so he's saying that there are some exceptionally strong men that might be able to reach that 300-pound mark, which that's what we're talking about in Dungeons and Dragons. That 300-pound mark is a commoner. Now, he would say, okay, this might not be completely unrealistic because there are exceptional people that can do that. But again, that's not the average. The average person is not doing this. There are also comments about the amount of weight that a farmer or someone living a rural life can carry. You see a lot of head carrying in different societies, and particularly with with both men and women. But this is a way of carrying a lot of weight very efficiently, and it doesn't actually add to your strength. And so I think the idea that 300 pounds or the strength 10 in D&D is enough or is realistic is just completely off base. And I really don't think there's any evidence to strongly support that, other than like I feel like people in the good old days were stronger than they are now. And again, there's just no real basis for that sort of thinking. He says, as for other lifts, there are pretty strong correlation between all of them, unless people train just one single thing, and it's unrealistic to kind of expect that. And it is realistic to kind of base, total strength off one single lift. This is another thing that I think to kind of go over the general, I feel like I'm kind of rambling a little bit. So let's talk about, take a moment here. Let's talk about how strength actually works. And there's something here that, a lot of you, we might feel like we know a lot about strength and what have you. Here's a question I would ask. And if you guys don't mind, drop it in the comments, drop it in chat, or, I'm not trying to trick anybody. I don't want anybody to feel like tricked or whatever. But if I can bend over at the waist and pick up a weight, okay, with both hands and lift it, maybe two dumbbells, let's say, and I can lift them up to my chest, right? And I'm bent over, I'm parallel to the ground. I can lift them up. Now, let's say I can do 50 pounds in each hand with dumbbells, and I can lift them. What if and that's the max, right? It's my 1 rep max. What if I did the same exact exercise, but I only used one hand? How much weight do you think I could lift? And I just want to see, this is kind of a test, right? To see if you feel like you know a lot about weightlifting and how the body works, then this should be a question you have a definitive answer for. And I'll kind of give everybody a minute if you guys want to chime in. If you have no idea, maybe just drop that in. That's fine too, if you don't know. But I'd be curious to know what everybody thinks. So the answer to that question and just the direction is, actually, we got a couple come in. The initial weight was 1 rep max. So everything I could lift, 50 pounds in each hands, 100 pounds total, and I lift it. Okay, I pull it up to my chest from the ground. Now I put those down, and again, hopefully I've rested. But now I do the same thing, bent over. Maybe I brace with my left hand, and I grab a weight, the heaviest weight I can grab. 50s were the max. How much can I lift? So in theory, it would be 50 pounds. I'm suggesting that it's not 50 pounds, it's something else. So I'm curious what everybody thinks that would be. So we'll come back to that in just a second. If people want to think about it and drop in their comments, I'm just curious. There's an interesting phenomenon here, and that's why I want to talk about this. I feel like there's people that are probably Googling it as they're watching this, like after the fact. Go for it. Knowledge is power. So, the ways that the body works and how strength actually works. As I mentioned, your fast twitch, your ability to lift heavy weights decreases rapidly with fatigue. And that accumulates fairly rapidly with fast twitch muscles. You can run, long distance all day long if you're trained for it, but you can't lift the heaviest weight you can lift all day long. So I think having something where potentially you take damage to your maximum attribute is an interesting way if you wanted to add some realism. I think that's far more grit than most people want, but it could be a really interesting way of dealing with that. And again, Start Here, which I recently reviewed, would be a great way of doing that, where they kind of have you take damage to an attribute. So that's one idea. Another thing that happens is that there are certain people who train specifically for one sport, powerlifting, for example, and there are folks who specialize in a couple of lifts. So maybe it's a clean and jerk, right? Or, lifting an Olympic lift where you're pulling the weight to your chest, or actually, yeah, you're pulling it to your chest. then you kind of lift as you drop down so that your arms are straight, and then you use your legs to stand back up. Okay, this is a standard Olympic lift. There are folks that will train for that, and they don't train literally any other muscles for weight training. And so what will happen is that they will be very efficient and very strong with certain muscle groups, but not with others. They don't train chest. They don't train abs. They don't train any other muscle that is not appropriate for lifting that much weight. And the reason for that is because of weight classes. So they want to stay as small as they can. And what can happen though is that your muscles don't really talk to each other. And so you can get really strong at one thing. You actually see this with archers where they get, someone who doesn't look very impressive can actually pull back an incredibly heavy bow. You call it weight on the bows, actually be able to draw a heavy weight bow. And that's because your muscles become very strong. The other thing is, and this is actually how we do research on strength and how to, maximize muscle growth and what have you, is that your muscles on one side of your body don't talk to muscles on the other side of your body. So you can get one side stronger. I think this was in like Lady in the Water or something. Didn't they have a character that was doing that? M. Night Shyamalan movie of some sort. This actually happens. And that's how they test. They'll actually have you do two different types of exercise with one with one leg or one arm, one side of the body, and the other one with the opposite. And then they'll see which cause more muscle growth. Okay. Because literally we know, because we've tested, that those things don't happen. So in TTRPGs, even though we're using strength as total body, which, as we know from our friend who's a powerlifting coach and decided to chime in, that's very realistic. Most average people. However, actually training for something specifically could greatly increase your strength at that one particular exercise. And so I think that is also something, if you want extra crunch in your TTRPG, it's something worth considering. I think in most situations you would leave strength the same, and this would be a feat or an ability or a skill or something else that would come into play. Okay, so let's go back and answer this question. So I forget what it's called. It's bilateral deficit phenomenon, I think. I don't see it in my notes, but yeah. Bilateral deficit phenomenon. So if I can lift 50 pounds with each hand and I reach down and only grab one weight, I could lift easily probably 80 pounds. More with one arm than I could with two. Okay, so I had 50 pounds in that arm before, and that was the most I could lift. If I only use one arm, I can typically lift way more. And it's funny because this is a phenomenon you see in a gym where I've been, working out and someone's like, holy moly, like, why do you have that huge weight? And it's like, oh no, they don't know that if you're just using one arm, one limb, that you can lift more weight. This is something we don't have a great explanation for. By the way, there's been at least that I know of in the last 4 years. I want to say 4 years, at least 8. And we don't know why, but it is absolutely a thing. And there's a lot of people who feel like they know a lot about, there's a lot of people who feel like they just know about things and they wouldn't understand this sort of thing, that this is actually a phenomenon. It's very clear. Everybody can do it. It's not magic, but it does feel like magic, but it is something that absolutely happens. And so, there's a lot of things about strength that I think people feel like they know, but the science kind of says something a bit different. Kind of like the idea that no, farmers are all, we all have our jacked old man farmer here, right? That's what all farmers look like, when in reality, that's just not the case. And if you look at a lot of places, you'll actually find people being fairly small and fairly skinny. So I think I want to jump over. This is only 3 minutes long, but this is from Dorks of Yore, which it looks like he hasn't posted a video in 6 years, unfortunately, but there's some interesting stuff here. I haven't seen any of his other videos, but let's just pop over and take a look. I think it's going to be pretty interesting.
Hey guys, I'm Pat Kilbane, and this is the first episode of RPG Science, where we explore the physics and biomechanics behind principles of tabletop role-playing games. Today, what we're exploring is halfling strength. I don't know if you've ever...
I just think this is so cool that he did this video.
Ever played a halfling in a D&D campaign? If you have, you understand the poetic nature of a small creature doing something really heroic. But halflings are so small, you kind of wonder if they would even get the job done. I mean, at 3 feet tall, they're about the height of a 5-year-old, which is really small. So to figure out how strong a halfling would be, we start with the strength of an average man. Since strength is proportional to the cross-sectional area of the muscle, we're going to find a cross-sectional area.
Yeah, this is true, by the way, for anybody who's not familiar with this. So what he means by cross-sectional area is that basically how wide, I guess, circumference kind of your muscle. That's where strength comes from. Sorry, I was driving. I did not know about bilateral phenomenon, but my guess was 75 pounds. Honest. Okay, that's awesome. Yeah, cool, man. That's the right direction. I was just trying to figure out if people would even understand that you can lift more with one hand than you can with two, because I think there's, again, a lot of times, guys, it's so easy to trick yourself. I do this. We all do this. Okay. It's so easy. People with PhDs do this all the time. Trick yourself. Just because you know about one thing doesn't mean you know a lot about another. As we mentioned with GURPS, GURPS was written by someone with a doctorate in physics. And whenever they said, I didn't understand why they had chosen this. And then someone in the comments, several people actually pointed out to me that in GURPS, it says, hey, here's your max lift. And it's the max you can lift in 1 second. If you double the time, you can double the amount you can lift. Meaning that if I lift the maximum I can in 1 second, if I just took 2 seconds, I should be able to lift twice that. Now, muscles don't work like that. The human body doesn't work like that. There's nothing I can lift in 1 second that I could lift twice that in 2 seconds when we're talking about the maximum amount. And then someone pointed out, no, it's just force equals mass times acceleration. So they're just saying, oh, well, if you just double the time, then you double the force, which would double the weight you can lift. And it's like, oh, it really just did come from physics, but the human body doesn't work like a physics equation, unfortunately. Me when I lift the sun by taking 1 year to do it. Exactly. Yeah. Which if you have, a lever, a pulley, right? You could do something like that, I suppose. But yeah, it doesn't actually make sense. There are other things like that where, you might feel like, hey, I know a little bit about physics, right? I studied some physics. So there are people that feel like, oh, diets. Well, it's just calories in versus calories out, and that's all there is to it, right? Now, obviously, to a large extent, that's true, but we've actually done research on this, and we know that in practical terms, that's not true, and that there are things that our body will start doing things more efficiently somehow. Somehow 1 calorie is getting us more work done. And we know this from experimentation, and there's other things you can do with accelerating our metabolism and what have you. So it's not as simple as it might first seem. As long as the pulley was long enough. Yeah, exactly.
Area index for this average man.
We're
going to divide his weight by his height in inches, and that gives...
So this is awesome, man. I love this. I am so sad that this guy's not making videos anymore. I think he has more on his channel too. Okay, so we've got the average height. So this is 5'8". That seems right. Is it 5'8"? Okay, it's like 5'8", 5'9", somewhere in there. Inches are horribly inaccurate, by the way. Someone was like, I gave my height in centimeters, and then I said I'm a little bit under 6 foot, and someone was like, those centimeters don't equal 6 feet. And it's like, dude, the centimeters are just more accurate. And then we've got weight 154. I've actually seen this a little bit higher, but this is video several years old. Another thing is like, just because people have, yeah, the average weight, this varies a ton. This varies by, I think it's 130 pounds. Divide that by 2.2. Sorry to get kilos there. 130 pounds in Asia and Africa, I believe. And then in Europe and the Americas, it's, or at least North America, it is, the average weight is like 180 or something like that, or close to it. I'm rounding off here, but the difference is 50 pounds. Or like 20 kilograms is the difference between the average average weight, depending on where you're at, which I think is really interesting if you're world building, right? If you want to make somebody who's very strong, like a people that are essentially Vikings, right? You could exaggerate that, make the average height 6'2". They're going to be so much stronger than the average person. And it's one of the ways, so many humans, people are like, playing a human is boring. Well, if you're from a society where the average person is 6'2", your strength should be at least a +2 in D&D. I mean, strength in D&D is a little bit all over the place, but you should have a significant bonus to your strength. The average American man is surely more than 154 pounds. Yeah, yeah. Shield wife. Hello, hello. I saw your comment. I chatted with you. I remember you. The average man in the U.S. is. I'm sorry, I'm going off memory here. I want to say close to 180. That's what I was talking about. It's like 170 something, 170. I don't know, 4, 6, or somewhere in there. And then in other places, it's much lower. And so that's where he's taking the average of the world. That's kind of what I was talking about earlier. I think probably before you dropped in, but there's not really any meaningful averages in my opinion, because the variation, Mayans, again, average Mayan is 5 foot tall. Okay. The average Scandinavian is, historically was like 5'9". Now it's like 5'11", and that changes a lot with proper nutrition and what have you. Yeah, and so obviously weight, but this is not bad. I don't think this is horrible, but yeah, for the U.S. we're definitely larger.
Gives us an index of 2.26.
I'm 250, 255, 255. By the way.
Right, now we're going to do the same thing with a halfling, and that gives us 1.25.
I just have to say this. It was really funny. Someone called me skinny fat in one of the comments, and I just thought that was hilarious because I'm not skinny anything. I might be fat, but I'm not skinny fat. I just thought that was funny. Okay, cool. So I'm sorry. So their height is 36 inches, 45 pounds. What do they bench press?
5. Now we take the 1.25, divide it by the 2.26 number of the average man, and we end up with 0.553, which means that a halfling is 55.3% as strong as the average man, or has a bench press of about 79.1 pounds, which is pretty cool. Like knowing what an average halfling will bench press, I think that's kind of awesome.
Yeah.
Now the 5th edition Player's Handbook says that the average person has a strength of between 10 and 11. So if we split the difference there and make it 10.5 and multiply that by the same 55.3%, we end up with a number of 5.8, or about 6. So a halfling's strength is going to be about 6 if it's an average halfling. Now 6 is not a great number. Obviously, he's going to have a -2 to attacks, a -2 to damage. But what this...
For anybody who doesn't know, that I think that's twice. If I don't know if 5e has modifiers, but usually halflings are like a -2 at the most any race. I don't think anybody's getting a -4 to strength, so this is not reflective of what we actually see in D&D.
number doesn't consider is that a halfling has excellent relative strength.
Does anybody know if in 5e, I don't remember, if halflings have a minus to strength?
Absolute strength is the amount of weight you can lift. It's your ability to exert force on other bodies. But relative strength is your pound for pound strength. It's your force to mass ratio. So a halfling who weighs 40...
I think it's a really important point, again, when you're talking about larger groups. A giant, someone who's 9 foot tall or more, insanely strong. I couldn't hurt someone who was that size. Literally, if I punched them, I couldn't generate enough force to meaningfully hurt them. Just like someone who's 100 pounds, it would be hard pressed to generate enough force to meaningfully hurt me. And funny story, or maybe not. I had a situation where there was someone who was intoxicated, and they're a small person, and 5'4" ish, I want to say, and there was some kids involved, and so I had to get involved. And at one point, this person punched me in the side of the head. And I'm just blindsided, right? Punched me inside of the head, and they had like rings on and everything. So it kind of hurt or whatever. But like, I didn't see it coming. They had a full wind up. They punched me inside of the head as hard as they could. They were pretty small too. They didn't have the force to knock me unconscious. Okay. And that's one of the things you'll find is like your head can only take so much damage. And that's why you see in heavyweight boxing and stuff like that, you see a lot more knockouts because they can generate enough force to knock someone out, because that doesn't really change with size. This person, I turned to them, I grabbed their arms, and I held them by their side, and they started then trying to kick, and I picked them up, swung them one way and then the other so that their feet swung out from underneath them, and then set them on the ground. And I had to hold them there until the police arrived. It was not a big deal. I did not have to hurt this person. I didn't have to, it was very easy for me to do that. Again, at about 220 pounds, with someone who would probably be, if they were less fat, probably like 120, maybe 110 pounds. That's the difference in strength. When you talk about twice the weight, the size of somebody, you're talking about strength levels where, and I think this is a problem a bit for TTRPGs, because you can't, if you have that, you can't have someone, it wouldn't be fun. I mean, yes, if you have weapons, that changes things, and you typically do in TTRPGs. But I still think that if you scaled it properly, strength, like how it actually is in real life, I don't think it would be fun for most people. I think it would just be like, yeah, just in medieval. You see this in GURPS a lot. In GURPS, it's so realistic, but the problem is if you're in medieval or any kind of fantasy themed where you're like, there's not modern weapons, you just want to be strong. Being strong is better than everything else. You can always do a ton of damage. Sure, a wizard can hurl a fireball, but you can do 3d6 damage all the time just by swinging a club and what have you. And so I do think that is a problem for TTRPGs. I think one of the cool and interesting ways you could handle this is, a lot of people like, if you're big and strong, it's not just about damage. Not everybody, it's about that fantasy fulfillment, right? Well, if I'm 9 feet tall and, most, walls in that society, if I can Kool-Aid man through the wall, just like charge through a wall, that's really cool. So if you allow them to maybe have more damage to structures or to inanimate objects. Similarly, and this is a problem in GURPS. GURPS, the rules for collisions are not, they don't make any sense to me. I'm sorry, but like, it's a situation. If you have someone who's 125 pounds and someone who's 250 pounds, and they run into each other, the person who's 255 pounds is not going to go anywhere. Okay. Except for maybe continuing on. The person who's half their weight is going to fly. Okay, that's physics. That's what's going to happen. And in GURPS, it's like impossible to knock anybody more than a meter. Unless even in extreme cases, it's incredibly hard. And so I think having ways where like you could move somebody who's a lot smaller than you without necessarily doing damage, think like a push kick or something else, then you could have interesting situations where there's a cliff or there's a pit or there's a wall. You could knock them into the wall. Maybe they take damage that way, and having something like that. I think he made a mistake on the bench press. He didn't square the number. Halflings should be weaker. Just implement stamina. I think he did like a ratio. I didn't actually follow exactly what he did. Um, I think his point is going to make sense regardless. But yeah, that's fair. I guess I would. What did he do? He said, hold on, let's see.
Area of the muscle, we're going to find a cross-sectional area index.
Yeah, so I think this is what he did. He uses the cross-sectional area index to say, okay, you're smaller, and so I think that's where he's using this to multiply by what we do know to come up with what we could, yeah.
For this average man, we're going to divide his weight by his height in inches.
Just implement stamina. What do you mean, Dr. Dank? If you don't mind elaborating.
And that gives us an index of 2.26. All right, now we're going to do the same thing with the halfling, and that gives us 1.25. Now we take the 1.25, divide it by the 2.26 number of the average man, and we end up with 0.553, which means that a halfling is 55.3% as strong as the average man, or has a bench press of about 79.1 pounds, which is pretty cool. Like knowing what an average halfling will bench press, I think that's kind of awesome. Now the fifth...
Shield Wife says, let's say humans are 6 feet tall, 200 pounds, and bench 200 pounds. Halflings 3 feet tall. Strength is proportional to cross-section area, which is proportional to height squared. Okay. Meaning that the human... Yeah, you're going to do that math for us? So in the case of the medieval fantasy issue of... a Mr. Really Strong guy being able to deal 3d6 damage all the time, instead make a stamina system and have things like that cost stamina. Dr. Dank, that way you can't just go all day long on Warpath, no stopping. Dr. Dank, I think that's a great I think that's a great idea. Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the problems with GURPS is there's nothing to really do with stamina unless you're a spellcaster. There are extra efforts, but basically you always have enough stamina to do as much extra effort as you want. Not as much, but a lot. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that would be one way, and that's also kind of the thing like we talked about, where like maybe you could say, oh, as your stamina goes down, your effective strength might also go down. So you can always do some damage, but you're not doing your max. Um, I'd love, I'd love just, I love to just speak on the matter because I'm typing up a storm. Oh, hey man, we can get you in comms here in a second if you want. Would be 4 times stronger. The halfling benches 50 pounds. Weight is proportional height cubed. Uh, 2 cubed is 8. The halfling in the same build would weigh 25 pounds and bench 50 pounds. I think Shield Wife. I think that his. I'm with you on that. I think. I think that we're going to come to the same conclusion though, as far as his point.
Fifth edition Player's Handbook says that the average person has a strength of between 10 and 11. So if we split the difference there and make it 10.5 and multiply that by the same 55.3%, we end up with a number of 5.8 or about 6. So a halfling's strength is going to be about 6 if it's an average halfling. Now 6 is not a great number, obviously. He's going to have a -2 to attacks, a -2 to damage, but what this number doesn't consider is that a halfling has excellent relative strength. Absolute strength is the amount of weight you can lift. It's your ability to exert force on other.
And I think this is the part where, even though he has different numbers, Shield, that he's going to come to the same or an interesting conclusion that holds, either way.
But relative strength is your pound for pound strength. It's your force to mass ratio. So a halfling who weighs 45 pounds and can bench press 79 pounds is lifting 175% of his body weight. Now, if you compare that to a man who's bench pressing only 93% of his body weight, the halfling is extraordinarily strong. So if you do the math there, a halfling, in terms of his pound for pound strength, has about a 20. Okay, so to summarize, a halfling is going to have a strength, this is the average halfling, a strength of about 6 when it comes to lifting, pushing, pulling, attacking, doing damage, that sort of thing. But a halfling should have a strength of about 20 when it comes to climbing or pull-ups or gymnastics, anything that's a matter of force to mass ratio. In real terms, a halfling would be half badass and half weakling. It all depends on what the circumstance would be. So what do you think? Do you think it would be cool if somehow the rules incorporated this dichotomy of strength? Let me know, guys. Doing damage.
That's it. That's the video. I think that is really interesting, and I think he has a great point here. I think there is something else we can do. I'd be curious if anybody has any thoughts before I share mine. But yeah, lifting, pushing, pulling, attacking, damage. Again, this damage is kind of a problem because, again, the halfling realistically can't do anything to someone stronger. It just wouldn't make, would a 3-foot tall child hurt you, right? Like maybe with a long enough, stick, a mace or something, maybe, but like it's actually going to be kind of hard. If a child attacks you, you don't really have, you're not at risk, your life is not at risk. Okay. Like, if an adult beat up a kid because they got attacked by a child, like that wouldn't really make any sense. The other thing about this is I've actually played GURPS with some guys who they treated dwarfs like someone with dwarfism, and I really didn't like that to put that as an understatement. And their idea was like they also wanted it to be proportional. So they're not talking about mythological, dwarfs or Tolkien-esque or whatever. And I think in most fantasy, those are actually, we treat dwarfs as like stronger. I remember I want to say 3rd edition GURPS, you would have increased carrying capacity on dwarfs, so probably in the current edition as well. which I thought was really fun. You know, maybe their bodies are literally built different so that they can while they might not be able to curl, right, but they can, if you put it on them, they can carry more weight for longer and what have you. And I thought that was really interesting. But the other side of that, of what they were doing, I think that it is it's not fun. And why are we doing that? And I don't think that there is a great reason for most of this stuff. Like, what fantasy is that fulfilling? People that are different than you or inferior? That's kind of what it feels like. Same thing with when we're talking about women. If you've got a different, take on that I'm not understanding, feel free to drop it, in the comments or in chat or whatever. I honestly probably don't want to go into it, but I'm always willing to learn or something. But that's what it feels like and what it seems like to me. Let me see here. Would be 4 times stronger. Halfling, benches 50 pounds. Okay, wait. Okay, cool. I think we already caught that. I see proportional strength as being represented by dexterity. Exactly. Shield light. That's exactly where I was going with this. Okay. D&D's take on strength is just completely flawed. Let's be real. Yeah. I think that's true. And I think it's not, so we're not bashing D&D guys. And honestly, most of TTRPGs, this is wrong. And the whole point is like maybe moving towards something that is better and more realistic, and not even more realistic, more fun, right? And I think that's the problem, right? When you have someone who's truly strong, someone who's as strong as like the strongest man currently in the world right now, IRL, having that feel like that matters, and that's like a big deal. And that there's a proper scaling, because if you have an elephant, if you introduce elephants into D&D, all of a sudden they're strength 30, the same as the giant dragon, because of how much they can lift. And it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. What if you want to play in a setting that war elephants are a thing? These were a thing historically. What if you want to have that in your game? How does that work? It doesn't really fit or make sense, and you would have to do a whole lot of homebrewing. And I'm all for homebrewing, but when you're having to basically recreate a system, you're not homebrewing. Well, you are homebrewing. You're creating your own TTRPG system. And while I've done many things like that, I think most people, and myself currently included, don't have time for it. And it's like, well, if it's this bad, we need to do something else. So that's the whole point of all of this, is to move towards something that makes a little bit more sense. His other point here about relative strength, and this being, so strength 20 for climbing, pull-ups, gymnastics, forced to mass activities. As Shield Wife pointed out, my take on this is that this is dexterity, at least in D&D, and how most TTRPGs treat this thing. So you might have a character who is a giant, 10 feet tall. Their strength is whatever. It's way off. It's off the normal charts in whatever system you're using. However, if they have dexterity, their dexterity could be low. And that means they are very strong, but they're not necessarily going to be good. And that also, in what that tells you here, the really cool thing about what we've just done, and Shield Wife, I really appreciate your input here. What we've done is we've said, okay, well, if we're going to have climbing, pull-ups, gymnastics, if we're going to have, jumping and other things, those should probably be based on dexterity in our TTRPG, or whatever stat we're using for dexterity. And that tells you what to base these stats on. And if you look up some of this stuff, you will find that this is not always true. And I pointed some of this out in the video. So I think that's really cool. I think it's a really interesting point. And I'm glad we got to talk about it. Let me drop into Discord here, Dr. Dank. If you want to join, we can chat, man. I know you got some stuff to say. Let me know. Just confirm for me in chat here if this will work for you. In which case, I will make us a chat and drop in there. Cool. And just give me just a second why I do this. That'll work for you. Okay, great. I wasn't sure if you were near a computer or what have you. Do me a favor, just drop into general, and I'll pull you down. Cool. And we'll see what Dr. Dank has to say. AKA Grizz, by the way. All right, let me move you down, man. Hey, you there?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you. Let me give me a mic check one more time.
All right, check 1 2. Can you hear me good? Is quality good?
Yeah, sounds great. I'm gonna crank you up a little bit. What do you got to say, man? What do you want to talk about?
So I definitely want to say that I agree with a lot of your points that right now the systems that we have, or like, any system that you can find at your local game store online, really just doesn't have a really realistic or, good strength scaling factor. They always have really cool spells for the wizards, but they don't really provide much to the martial classes. And, I'm all with for trying to fix that and just make a better system overall.
Yeah. Have you played anything like Vampire or anything else like that? Werewolf.
So when it comes to systems that I've played Vampire the Masquerade. I forget what edition. And I've also played, I believe it was another system made by the same company called Scion. It's like a Greek style where you're a demigod thing. Um, Played a lot of different systems like that. And the strength factor when it comes to those systems, again, they're like thinking about supernatural things. They're not even thinking about humans at that point, right? Um,
Yeah, but you so far you still stick with like because I feel like I'm just curious. I feel like you might have overstated that a little bit
yeah.
for my personal experience, but I am with you that most of them are pretty bad. Another thing on this topic, and I know it's a little bit off, but I think it applies, is when reading. So I've spent a lot of I've lived outside for if you combine the days for literal years of my life, and I also like to read avidly. Right, I'm a nerd, and one of the things I'll notice is that there will be a lot of writers who will they will say things that are just objectively they're the opposite of what is true. So one example of this is when people are like, oh, it's getting cold at night, so we'll need to find a place to shelter in place. If it's getting cold at night and you don't have a way of making a fire, it's actually best to move at night and sleep during the day some, because it gets cold at night. And if you're moving, you generate an insane amount of heat. As long as you have the calories for it, and as long as you can see, which most of the time, unless there's no moon, you can actually see quite well. And if there's a full moon, it's almost like daytime once your eyes adjust. Again, depending on your setting. And that's just like one example of something where a writer who maybe hasn't done any of that stuff just has no concept. And so I think this happens a lot with us nerds because we're not always the most physically active in regards to a lot of this stuff. So we're like, oh, this seems reasonable. But it turns out that like what is reasonable to us is actually like, no, humans are capable of some pretty crazy feats.
Yeah, I have to agree there as well. I remember seeing a really very, very down to earth movie. I forget the name, but it was a man trying to survive in this super wintry climate, very, very cold, and it was like getting, becoming nighttime. And if he doesn't make it back, he's gonna die. And I remember him like actually, in order to keep his heat up, like, hitting his arms, like, hugging himself, trying to just get the motion and like generate more heat so that he can keep going, even though the cold is like, starting to really get to him. Um,
Yeah,
and
you can't get good. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all good. But another thing is that like do you know like the like how big temperatures like the temperature swings when it comes to deserts like the Sahara? Like it gets extremely hot during the day, but during the night, since there's nothing to hold on to that heat, it can actually get pretty cold.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, and like um
at,
to
at, at one point I was living in a tent in Alaska, and during the winter, and I would get up in the morning, and I would get up and I would walk, and it turned out it was about a mile. I would go walk about a mile so that I would my internal temperature would go up high enough that I was comfortable then making breakfast. But because before that it just sucked to make breakfast. I mean, I could. I was just freezing. I was just freezing. And so I get up, get out of my tent, go walk a mile, come back, and then make breakfast. And then I would get up and then go hike the whole day. Burned a ton of calories that way, but that's actually the best thing to do if you have them to spare.
Oh yeah, because you have to get your body jump started at that point, and if you don't, you're just gonna stay in bed all day, and then eventually you're gonna have no energy to do anything.
Well, and it just sucks,
Yeah, yeah,
like
no.
you want to like enjoy breakfast or whatever. So it made sense. That's why I was mostly doing it.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, like, I'm sure we've all been there. Like, waking up, it's really cold in your room, and you want to stay under your
Yeah.
blankets, but you got to get up and get things done.
Yeah, exactly.
But going back to the tabletop RPG realism um debate, though, is would you include these things in your tabletop RPG? I mean, personally, I wouldn't, because like there's grindiness, but then there's like hitting the point where like, all right, come on, you got to roll a con save or something in order to get out of bed so you can make breakfast. Like that's
Oh.
I think that's a little bit too ridiculous.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I
Um.
wasn't sure what you meant by these things. Like
Yeah.
no.
Yeah. Like like the temperature debuffs, and so I mean some of it is good, but there are some specific things that
I
could
I could see being like made very cold by like a cone of cold or something like that, giving
yeah,
giving you minuses, right? Like that's essentially what
yeah,
you're doing. Is like, oh, you get hit by this spell, you're at a -2 to all of your dexterity based things for the next X rounds. I could actually see that being useful.
yeah. I agree. But yeah, the hang on, let me just try and like refocus my
Oh,
thoughts. It
you're
was a
good.
long
Yeah,
day
yeah.
at work.
Oh no, you're fine. You're fine. I'll chat while you're doing that. Yeah, I think that one of the things that and you might want to talk about this as well, as might be where you're going with some of this, is I saw a lot of comments that were some of the more higher quality comments. I'm not trying to throw shade, but I think that's the best way to put it. People talked about like, hey, strength is linear in D&D, and that's why it's a problem. Other people suggested using nonlinear systems and what have you. I think that like I think that's a good solution. I think that's a solution. I think there could be others, but I think the idea for me is mainly having important critical points and having them represented. So again, we have the idea of the average person. Sure. Maybe we have the idea of someone who's a little bit stronger. Yeah, that seems reasonable. Then we have someone who is really strong. Okay. And then we have someone who's like, maybe they exist in real life, right? But they're and we're talking about modern day, right? Like they're chemically enhanced. They are, or someone who's like a giant or a half giant, someone who's 7 foot tall, what have you. This is a different level. And then you have someone who's like 12 or 15 feet tall or whatever. But having these important jumps along the way, I think is what is critical. And if you want to do a simple system, I think you can still do that. And if you want to do a more granular system where there's more of a curve and what have you, I think you can do that. And then there were also folks that commented, only a couple, that were talking about, well, like, oh, they just did this to be simple or what have you. I am all for taking complex things and simplifying them so that they're easy to use. However, there should be, in theory, some solid reasoning and functioning behind that. And then also saying like, hey, we just did this so the math is easy. And a lot of people felt like one system or another, they just did this to be simple. And I don't really think I think there's a little bit of a cop out on that. Is that what you're looking for in your like kind of strength scale, or what would have you in a TTRPG, or what appeals to you, I suppose?
All right, that's a lot of good questions, but I'm going to try to answer all of them. So initially, I think we just have to recognize the fact that if we move from a very complex system that has a lot of mathematical answers for strength, and we try and move towards like a more simpler system, that we are going to have to make sacrifices at the end of the day. Um, no doubt about that. I do think that if your cup of tea is a simpler system, that all the power to you. But for me, I am a huge fan of granular, just like, pulling out the math book, pulling out the calculator, and trying to represent this strength system as realistically as possible without hitting that, crossing that line of, okay, this is getting ridiculous.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
If to that point, I just want to say that the thing is where a lot of us started and start is that we just want something that works, right? You don't want to start a game
yeah,
that's insanely. I love complex games. I don't
yes,
want to. I've read. Oh my gosh, I want to say it was Dungeon Lords. Maybe there's a board game I've read, and it's like first you should start off doing the simple version of this. And then it was like, now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, no, I'm an advanced player. I can jump into the complex version. Don't do that. We know we're hardcore gamers too. It's a bad idea. Don't do it. And I was like, that's hilarious because that's exactly what I was thinking. And it's like, yeah, sometimes you don't need that complexity. However, what happens over time, and this is what happened, at least with my experience, is that I was a kid and I used to just read first edition, second edition, just read. And I had stuff memorized. And then 3.5 came out and same thing, right? I knew what page you could find the skills on. I knew where stuff was at just by heart. And at some point, that whatever complex it is, it's now a known thing. And so now it's not complex at all, right? Because you just know what it is. And then it's like, well, you know what would be cool? Like, oh, well, me and this other person both have a 16 strength, but like I'm more dexterous. How does that, come into play? Or maybe not that. That's not a good example, but there comes some where you want more granularity. And at that point in time, when you know the rules very well and you're very familiar with them, that's when a lot of the average person, not someone who maybe is like me and you, who prefers more crunch, period, but that's where the average person will then want to add a bit of crunch. Not everybody is like that, as people have mentioned recently, like Bob World Builder just apparently really likes light TTRPGs. Sure, that might be you. There's other people out there and what have you, but I think most people fall into that middle ground. And so I think yes, there's a bunch of people that got into D&D. I think over time, those people will gradually, at least some number of them will migrate towards more complex systems.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. There's actually, now that you bring that up, like the difference between light and more granular systems, an observation I'd like to point out, as if like, current modern tabletop gaming, is that there's a lot of light systems that are out there right now for someone who's like into that, but I don't really see that many granular systems like being played or out there right now.
Yeah.
And it just goes back to like, in the table, TTRPG, you know, take the G, bold it, and underline it, and also like capitalize it as well when it comes to me. But for those, but that's just me.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
to just make your point more clear, because I said this actually in the video where like I really like the game portion. I like optimizing for games. I like solving them. Doesn't matter what it is, chess, whatever. And so that's one of the things I really enjoy. There are some people said, oh no, it's like simulationist. I mean simulationist. And I actually don't mean that. I just want to make that clear. It's not about simulating reality, it's making a fun game. And that's where it's like, yeah, I understand how if you did strength exactly like real life, it wouldn't be fun because someone who's average strength can't hurt someone who is 9 feet tall. It's just not physically possible. And so it's like, yeah, but I want that 9 foot tall person to be able to do something. If they can run through a wall, a brick wall, then that's cool. And it's like, okay, that's a fun thing. And it's something that adds to everybody's fun at the table, not just their fun as they roll a d20 for damage.
Yeah, absolutely. And back to that question where it was like linear versus exponential, when it comes to like a scale of 1 to 20 and then like a little bit higher, I think exponential is definitely the way to go. Um, exponential strength while also, trying to hit those higher values would also be exponentially more difficult. The average person can stay at a 10, sure, but as you approach that 18, 19, 20, that's where you start going beyond the strongest man, in the realistic world to we are now supernaturally strong and we can start chucking cars at people or what have you.
Yeah, and I think doing something like a logarithmic scale. So for
Yeah.
those who are not familiar, a logarithmic scale is when you have something that might have an exponential curve to it, where the jump is not linear. So the difference between a 1 and a 2 is not is not the same as the difference between a 2 and a 3. But you make it into something that is linear that counts up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm not doing a very good job of explaining in plain terms what a logarithmic scale is, but earthquakes are on a logarithmic scale. If you're curious about it, you could Google that. That's also something you can do where the scale
Yeah,
itself.
the Richter scale.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the Richter scale. Yeah, and there are many other things, and the reason for that is because the numbers they go up so quickly and it is so exponential that it doesn't really make sense to us. So in the case of a Richter scale, we're using a logarithmic so that it can be something we understand. But the difference between a magnitude 5 and a magnitude 6 earthquake is much different than the difference between a magnitude 4 and a magnitude 5 earthquake. And so that's when they start getting higher. I don't think a lot of people necessarily appreciate that with earthquakes, but that's what's going on. And I think that could be a really good way to deal with this in TTRPGs. But I also think at the same time, you want to make sure that that's clear to folks so that they understand that, like, the difference between your 10 going to 11 and a 17 going to an 18 are two very different things.
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to complex systems, clarity is going to be the most important thing, and making sure that everyone at the table understands the level of strength at play here when people are, rolling around with 17, 18 strength versus 10 to 11 strength. That's going to be something that someone is definitely going to have to explain to like newcomers, or even people who have, a lot of experience in tabletop RPGs but have never tried a granular system before. They're, going to have to keep their ears open and try and understand what we're trying to get at here.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
Yeah. The what else? What were the other questions that you asked?
Oh,
I'm sorry. I'm kind of
I don't,
thinking.
I don't know. They're all gone now. Um,
This
there is I want to I forgot to read this earlier. If I can, I want to read. So my friend did drop me some comments here, and I want to read those. And then I actually have another place I want to go with you that get your thoughts on it or what have you. So
mm,
I'll start with just reading this here. So his major thoughts in case they helped us out here, were his feelings were that first off, ancient peoples and farmers weren't stronger than trained people today. That's I think that's absolutely true. um, your body gets better at what you use it for. So a farmer who lives 50-pound hay bales. Also, this is someone who owns horses, by the way, a couple.
mm,
So he knows a little bit about some of this stuff. Who lifts hay bales and 100 times a day will get very good at lifting hay bales, but not any better at deadlifting 400 pounds because they don't train that. What they do is have high endurance, which I think is very much to your point, Grizz. Um, and then he said, nutrition is critical to strength. Ancient history did not have good nutrition. Absolutely. And then the last thing here is TTRPGs, or maybe there's one more. TTRPGs are games. They try to build a game that allows users to play their character and have rules on what they can do. Strength is easy to set numerical, concrete rules around because everyone is familiar with lifting and how much stuff weighs. Most games get it wrong because they need to make math easy. I don't know if I agree with them. This last part. I think that you don't. I don't think we need to make the math. I don't think we need a dumb. Someone else pointed this out where they're like, "Oh, the reason that they chose strength and then you multiply that times 15 or 30, is to make it simple." I don't think that most people can multiply 13 times 15 in their head. And so if you have to use a calculator for it, making it a little bit more complicated is not going to be an issue. Um, yeah, I just think that I could be wrong. I am someone who enjoys doing math in my head, so I could figure that out probably. It would take me a minute, but I don't think that making it a little bit more difficult is really going to change anything. And then let me see here. D&D often and this is someone who really likes D&D, guys, just FYI. D&D often fails at strength fantasy because the strength 10 character is someone who goes to the gym a lot. Many real life men can lift more than that, and they are only 2 times as strong as a wizard compared to the charisma where a character playing a 20 charisma, like they can talk to plant. Oh, I'm sorry, like they can talk the pants off a dragon, but a 10 charisma might as well not speak in the game. I think that's a fair point. He's comparing like a strength 20 character to a strength 10 character versus a charisma 20 character to a strength 10 character. If I got all that right. Let me catch up on these comments real quick too.
yeah.
So Shieldwife says lift 101 pounds, strength equals 1. Oh, I'm sorry. there might be a space in there. I apologize, guys. My chat sometimes it's I get it in a different text format than you guys do, and it's kind of hard for me to read. I'm sorry. Lift. Oh, lift 10 pounds. That's what you said. Strength equals 1. Lift 100 pounds. Strength equals 2. Lift 1,000 pounds. Strength equals 3. That would be 10 base logarithmic strength. And Shield Wife, is that what they do in Vampire, or you just mentioning this? Because yeah, that would, yeah, a base 10 logarithmic strength, that would work. And then GDS here says, honestly, I don't think D&D is even supposed to be realistic in any regard, combat, stats, etc. GDS, I would just say, yeah, that's fair, man. The thing is, I think it originally was meant to be realistic. That's where wargaming comes from. That's why they had women being less strong than men, and I think there's a lot of things like that. Maybe modern D&D is honestly, I don't want to be, I'll piss people off just by saying kind of honest truths, I guess. The modern D&D has, there's a lot of problems because we took Tolkien as fantasy and then we added a bunch of stuff to it without actually doing any of the world building. So that creates a lot of problems, like when magic replaces technology. How does that change the society? But I also think, as far as the stats and everything in the game, that they just don't. They've actually gotten worse over the years, and they fourth edition really jumped the shark on that, where like fourth edition was a board game, and that's, they didn't care about simulationist or it being like, based it went from being based on war games to being based on board games. That's how the mechanics in 4e worked, and I think they walked some of that back with 5e, but I think they're just in a really weird place where I don't know if anybody could, I'm sure someone could come up with like, here's what 5e does as far as simulationist or something else. But I think that most people approach it from the aspect, we all have real life as our main basis, and so that's a good place, I think, to start. And sure, you can use superheroes and what have you, but we have all of that stuff in common. And so just to say, it's a game onto itself, and it's not based in any sort of reality. I mean, we're role playing, we're playing particular characters, and we want our characters to feel strong and powerful based on what we know about real life. So I think it should, in a lot of ways. It doesn't have to be realistic, it doesn't even have to be simulationist, but it does need to be consistent, I think. And it's not, and I think that's the big problem. Again, reference, the dragon is as strong as an elephant, but is 10 times as the size. A deity is weaker than an elephant. That kind of stuff. Shield Wife says, I think that realism is always important, at least should be balanced with the game balance. Having real world meaning to what characters do is what makes imagining it interesting. And then GD says, you're right, I should have clarified modern DD. Okay. All right. Grits, do you have anything you want to add to that before I ask, or kind of ask the questions I was going to ask?
Okay, so actually, I have a lot to say on those specific topics that you mentioned before.
Okay, great.
So, I think you hit the nail on the head when it comes to consistency. I think just having a consistent rule set that we can, accept that, okay, this makes sense without, trying to cheese the rules, because I'm sure we all know about, the 1,000 peasants shooting a laser guided missile joke. But
I don't know if we
going
do. I don't know if we do. Can you tell it just real quick?
okay, so it's like a little cheese in fifth edition, like rules is going by how the rules are written. Um, a round is 6 seconds. Uh, I think I'm right. Can you fact check me on that? I think a
I'm
round is 6 seconds.
all good.
Okay, but
Close enough.
okay,
6 or 10.
okay, but a round is 6 seconds, and reactions are instant. So if you had 1,000 peasants, right, in a line, perfectly straight line, and all of the peasants said the reaction was, the moment that the peasant behind me passes the spear to me, I'm going to pass it to the next one in front of me. And so the peasant in the back starts, and they all pass this spear within, I don't know, like less than a second. And by the time the spear hits the end of the villager, it, like, the last villager, and he like releases it, it's going to have all that momentum from the first villager all the way to the last villager. And that's just like one very silly, dumb thing that can happen because D&D doesn't clarify that that shouldn't happen because all of the reactions are happening at the same time.
Yeah, and I'll just add
Yes.
to that that their take on the newest edition, the 2024 edition, was to basically insult people who point out things like this and to say, "Oh yeah, this stuff just isn't allowed." As opposed to making the rules in a way that makes sense, which would be difficult, they just said, "Oh yeah, we'll make fun of that, and yeah, you shouldn't do that," which I personally felt a little bit insulted by, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I felt a little bit insulted as well when it comes to stuff like that. I mean, there's a time and place for everything, don't get me wrong. There are some times where the DM has to put their foot down and say, you know, we don't allow that here. But when it comes to things like that, surely they could have just, you know, went back and redid the rules and fixed things. Um, as for the I think when it comes to 5e, the things that they do try to simulate, like encumbrance, funnily enough, everyone at every table that I've been to just completely negates that, ignores that. Um,
Yeah.
which I don't know. I just find that like funny in like an ironic sort of way. But even back in second edition, which is what I've been playing recently, there are, you know, the way they scale statistics isn't really amazingly realistic either. Um, the like I have an excerpt from second edition here where strength, your strength score is, let me just find the correct chapter here. Character. It's let me see. Here we go. Player's handbook, and here we go. Strength. A character's strength, you take your score and you multiply it by 10, and that is the maximum amount of weight that you can pull above your head in a military press. For example, if you have a strength of 3, you can military press 30, 18, 180. And so even then, it's scaled, like, you know, it was just multiplied by 10, and that's
Okay.
how much you can military press.
Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, I think I'm like
But
strength 20 or something,
yeah, you can
which,
congratulate you can military press 200. Like, but what's really funny about that though is
uh,
that 18 was the maximum human strength, and if you had an 18 as a fighter, if you had an 18 strength as a fighter, you were actually given a lot of bonuses. Um, you had a lot of you gained XP faster. Your weight allowance, or like how much you can carry, goes up by 3,000, and you can bend bars and lift gates 40% of the time. So you can like just grab like the bars of a cell, for example, and just bend them. So they knew that like being able to military press 180 pounds wasn't really, you know, a good enough of a fantasy for the martial characters at the time. And so they can, you know, they conceded that and added these additional dice roll statistics, like dice roll things here, so that, you know, the fighter could actually feel like
yeah,
a juggernaut.
yeah.
Um, but like back to your, also, I know I'm talking a lot, but
No,
uh
you're good. That's what
but
we're here
back,
for. Can I just say
yeah.
real quick? I did have a character that rolled like a 90 something on that, and I love that character.
Oh, it's so awesome when you like roll high and get like the 18 over 90 or 18 over 100. You're just like a super
Yeah, for those who
super.
don't know, real quick, if you had an 18 in your strength, you would then get to roll a D100, and that would be what you would that would be your like you'd have 100 and or I'm sorry 18 and then whatever that was, and when you got to the really high numbers, it was crazy. You got to do cool stuff.
It was awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah. But back to your point on perception. You have to like you know, I have to stress here that Gygax and like, you know, his gang, you know, his goobers, his gang of goobers at the time, they were all nerds. They played what's it called? They played military simulations, and I assume none of them were bodybuilders, which is why wizards were always so much stronger in D&D compared to martials, because they didn't really, you know, have that understanding of reality at the time. Um,
yeah. Yeah,
it's
and I think
just, you
that's
know,
where a lot of this comes from.
yeah.
Someone wrote in my comments that they were a writer, and that they said they actually used like army field manuals as a way of getting what an idea of what is realistic, and I think that's a great way to do it. Just as a by the by, if I can, real quick, I just wanted to catch up on chat.
Yeah.
here. Shield Wife said, I was just trying to discuss logarithmics a little bit. Thank you for that, Shield. I now understand why you did that. Hopefully, my reading your comment aloud, people understood that that's what you were explaining while I was. I'm a little slow sometimes. And then she says that vampire is a little different. It uses bench press. Strength 1 is 40 pounds, strength 2, 100 pounds, strength 3, 250. Okay, and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's also fine. And then she also said, Shield Wife here says, humans go 1 to 5 with 2 representing average. And then GDS here says, historically, I think it's probably more realistic to have strength proportional to your body weight and higher weightlifting skill. I think I want to get into this GDS actually, so that's a good point. And I think you said earlier, sorry, I think I missed one. That's true. It should be. I think it's sort of a reference to the D&D comment, but I think D&D 5e is totally inconsistent. And it's really hard to make sense of. Yeah, exactly. GDS. I think we're on the same page with that, man. I think I misunderstood you. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And again, guys, understand that we're not bashing any one system, right? I mean, D&D is the biggest in the neighborhood, so we're punching up if anything. But the point is that if you like something, you want it to improve, and so you will have feedback for it. And I think that's where it's at. And for a lot of people, especially if you're new, this stuff won't bother you. You won't notice this stuff, and that's totally fine. It's just when you're, I don't know. Some nerds are built different than other nerds, and you're like, well, I don't want you to hand wave that my character can do this thing. I want to know specifically how much he can do, and what if we get everybody else on board, and what have you. Shield Wife also says, historically, I think it's probably more realistic to have strength proportional to your body weight and high weight lifting be a skill. Okay, or I'm sorry, that was GDS. I'm sorry. And then Shield Wife said proportional to weight? Question mark. Would that mean that after your character strength is determined, that number determines character weight? And then GDS pointed out that's one way to do it. Shield Wife here says RuneQuest has a size attribute that added to hit points and damage. If your size was higher than your strength, it slowed down. Grizz, would you be up for? Because I do have something in a little bit. We've got another 20 minutes or so. Maybe less, but do you mind if we transition here and kind of talk about ways of building and ways of handling some of this stuff? Did you have anything else? I mean, if you have anything else you want to say, definitely come out with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to throw out some last things there. I think we have to understand that D&D was able to bring a lot of new players to the hobby, and you know what?
Yeah,
All the power to them.
it's
But
awesome to have
yeah,
the hobby
yeah,
growing.
exactly. But we just have to understand that the system has its flaws, and as nerds who like realism, that we're going to have to either improve on this a lot and homebrew the heck out of this, or make our own system,
Yeah.
or try and find something that'll satisfy our desires. But
Yeah, and on that note about new people, just because I'm really passionate about this, guys, there are sometimes people that will be like, "Oh, you're new. I was here back in the day." I have been playing D&D since I was a very, very young. Okay, and I've known about it, and I was super into it. Okay, there are plenty of people that got into it before me, and it's just like this one-upping game. Okay, it doesn't matter when you got in. We're just glad you're here. We're all playing games together. And if someone is like, "Oh, you didn't know about in my day, we did it," whatever. I don't know. Let people be whatever they're going to be. But the most of us are just glad that we're all here. And I don't care if you've been playing since yesterday, or you've been playing for since the beginning, or since before the beginning, or whatever. There's all, yeah. We're just glad you're here, and it's all about having fun with friends. And we never, at least I never want to gatekeep people. The more the merrier.
exactly. And one last thing: if a medieval farmer lifts hay bales all day, they'd have a very powerful lift skill, but their strength would not be that high.
Okay. Yeah, there we go. Uh, you got to go, man, or do you want to stick around for the last little bit here?
Oh no,
I'd love to have you.
I'm completely free. I'm completely free.
Okay, awesome. Well, yeah. So I just kind of want to talk about this, and I'm sorry, I apologize. This was a live stream, so I didn't get all my notes fully fleshed out and defined, and what have you. And probably we could talk about this for a very long time. But
Yeah.
ways of dealing with this. So I think one of the ways we've kind of come up with is, and I'll chat for a bit, and then when you have some ideas, I'll give you a moment to collect your thoughts, and then you can chime in. When when you're talking about strength, I think strength is a good thing to have. Having dexterity be a secondary aspect, I think that's a great idea. I think understanding that, systems are different. You can base a lot of things on your attributes. and that can be good. However, oftentimes that can be its own problem. So, how you want to do that, certainly, as we pointed out here on the screen here, the climbing, pull ups, gymnastics, stuff like this is probably more dexterity based and has to do with your strength to weight ratio. And while that doesn't make perfect sense, it's simple enough and makes enough sense that I think it's a one good way to do it. And if you want to come up with some other good way to do it, that's cool as well. I think, hey, Nani, thanks for joining. And another thing here is that if you're talking about, you know, so let's say you want to have a particularly strong character, a character that you have this in GURPS where you can pull back a stronger bow than your strength would particularly, specifically measure. I think that's a great way to do it. I think if you're talking about some other system, maybe in D&D it's a feat, right? We already have this. And so basically saying that, like, yeah, if you take this, expert bowman skill or feat or whatever it happens to be, that you can do more damage with a bow. And this represents a way that you are stronger with that one particular activity than you are with other things. And this is very true to real life and makes sense. So it does. And a lot of people, this might not seem like it, but it is actually true and it does actually make sense. So that is another way of dealing with and kind of addressing this stuff. A lot of times, I think GDS is kind of pointing this out as well, is that, having a lifting skill. I think is, and I'm not sure what all you mean with that, but having a lifting skill could absolutely be something where you're particularly good at lifting things. One thing I think could be really cool is that a dwarven belt, which is basically a weightlifting belt. A weightlifting belt increases your abdominal pressure and allows you, whenever you're lifting things like in a deadlift, it actually allows you to lift like 10, 15, maybe 20 pounds, probably not more than that, but it actually allows you to lift more weight. Who's to say that dwarves should have girdles as far as I'm concerned, and they should be functional. Sure, you can like loosen it up whenever you're just around town, but you might like crank it, ratchet the belt down whenever you're going to lift something heavy. And something like that, you could have a small item that allows you to increase your lifting strength or something like that. That's not even magical. Okay. And then obviously a, dwarven or a giant girdle or a belt of giant strength is already, we've already thought about this, right? It's already in the game, but that's just one way of kind of addressing stuff like that. Also, with specific lifts and being able to do something super specific, again, if you want to use skills, if you're talking about GURPS, if you want to use something like techniques, or if you were talking about D&D and you want to use something like feats, certain other rules light systems, there would be other ways of dealing with that. I'm trying to think of all the ones off the top of my head, but having something like that to express that you're particularly strong for your size or what have you when it comes to non-combat things is one way of dealing with that. And as I'm kind of thinking about this, like, I don't know, throw out in comments, guys, what else do we need to be concerned about with strength that we haven't really addressed, and maybe some ways of dealing with some of that stuff. Grizz, do you have anything that pops into your head or that comes up a lot for you?
Um, well, I think first and foremost, when it comes to strength, there has to be a distinction made between what is strength and what is dexterity or agility. Um, the issue that I think we may run into is that the athletic skill. I think you actually touched up on this in your original video, where you talked about someone having an extremely high athletic score outswimming someone who's very limber and dexterous, which doesn't really make much sense. Um, the main problem I see here is that if we were to look at the example of sports like soccer or swimming or boxing, is that dexterity or agility in some games is going to be very underappreciated if we tried translating this to a purely D&D standpoint. Um, strength might be the amount of might no, strength may be representative of how much force you can exude at any given time, but dexterity should represent how quickly you can change things up when the time calls for it.
Can you explain more of what you mean by if it sport not translating to TTRPGs?
Oh, well, not just, well, I wouldn't try and translate sports to TTRPGs. I'm just saying if we were to translate sports to D&D, because I don't have enough experience to just broadly state things like sport to TTRPGs. But if like, say if I was trying to simulate a soccer game in 5th edition, it would call for a lot of athletics checks, athletics only deriving from strength. Um, there's not really a dexterity variant of athletics, at least not in the base rules.
Okay, I see what you mean there.
Yeah.
I think that also comes to the fact that, as we kind of talked about, gymnastics, climbing, pull ups, I think athletics absolutely falls in this category and probably would make more sense being associated with dexterity. Obviously, the problem is that in that case, dexterity just becomes the uber attribute for
Yeah.
D&D, which it already kind of is. And then
Yeah.
GDS here says one complication is that strength is often a prerequisite for speed slash athletic movement. For example, in martial arts, getting stronger also makes you faster unless you really overdo it with bodybuilding, of course. Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. I think that that is part of understanding that, hey, dexterity is, there, like dexterity is um, an abstract concept, and none of this stuff is purely makes sense. Strength is also, even though we think we know what strength is, it's also an abstract concept when it comes to TTRPGs. And so, what we mean by strength in TTRPGs is actually fast twitch muscles specifically. And then, even then, as GDS is pointing out, when we're talking about athleticism and stuff like that, we don't actually even really consider that to be based on strength, even though, yeah, it's a critical part of it. And I think this just comes from the basics of what you have to do with abstracting this a little bit, at least a couple of degrees, if you want to be able to make a system that it makes sense. And I think that's one of the things you really have to try to do. This is also one of the reasons that I think it's so important to stick with something that is somewhat based in reality, because in reality we had so and that's why we judge these things as being fair or unfair, making sense and not making sense, is that we understand that if you're being really strong does have advantages. And so if we've kind of talked ourselves into a corner here, a little bit by saying that, like, oh, all this is dexterity, and so then dexterity is the uber skill, but we actually know that's not true in real life. So what are we missing is the question I would ask, and I think this is why it can be so useful to base these things on what we observe in our experience IRL, and so we can have a basis for this and be able to figure it out. GDS also says maybe you can divide overload dexterity into gross movements and 5 movements. Just an idea. GURPS actually does that, GDS. Maybe not in the way that you're referring to, but yeah, absolutely. Grizz, do you have anything to add to that?
No, you kind of, you know, really just took the words from my own mouth there. Is that, like, if dexterity really just, if we try and represent dexterity the way it is now, it's going to be this uber stat where you can, like, do all these flicker agile movements. Meanwhile, strength is just, like, this I'm strong stat,
Yeah.
if we keep going down this route.
One of the things that I am really interested in, and I'm someone who leans on the crunch scale, and my approach to dealing with a lot of this stuff is like to figure out the crunchiest version. And then if you want to lighten it up, to do that. And I get that approach from my understanding of how a lot of like digital games and stuff are made. Um, and actually, no, just games in general, how some of them are made. And I like that approach to it. One of the things I really like is mass. And I think a couple of people, maybe Shield or GDS, has mentioned this before, but the idea of mass is I have been on a college campus, and I was like I was like 220 at the time, and then I probably had at least 50 pounds of books and a computer and whatever in my bag, and someone ran into me, and so I'm like 270 with all that stuff on. I didn't move. And the other person did. And I think that that is an interesting thing to explore, to be able to use in TTRPGs, being able to move characters. I also think it makes for interesting tactical combat. And so having something, as GDS you're kind of talking about, with weight and what have you, could be one interesting way to do that. Again, I think the one thing you have to worry about if you're going to do that, and one thing to consider, is that people want to play the character they want to play. and maybe they want their character to be, really skinny, but still very strong, and they don't necessarily want to get knocked around a whole lot. Now, something like GURPS actually has rules for all of this stuff. I'm not 100% happy with all of them, but you also want to leave room that if someone says, hey, my character is skinny, but I don't actually have the skinny disadvantage because I don't want that. And I think that should also be fine, right? This is the same thing as like, well, you're playing a female character, so they just got to be weaker, or you're playing a guy, so they just got to be dumber because only an idiot would say something like that. but I think,
Yeah, no, I agree there. Um, Again, this is a game at the end of the day, and moreover, this is a fantasy game. This is, we're trying to put our fantasy characters in there. Mind you, we do have a foundation in realism, but we're not trying to simulate it one to one. Because if we did, then we'd have to like work out 12 hours a day in order to actually hit like 20 strength or something. It wouldn't be fun at the end of the day, and that's why we're here.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if I've got anything else, and I think we're approaching time. Guys, if you have any other questions or anything, go ahead and drop in the or anything you want to say to everybody. Please drop it in the comments here, and we'll give it a second. Grizz, I appreciate you dropping in, man.
Yeah, no, the pleasure's all mine. It was awesome being able to appear on this stream in such short notice. But I actually wanted to talk about the stamina thing that I mentioned before,
Oh yeah,
where,
please.
yeah, so like, given that, say if we like, make strength actually really strong, really impactful, really powerful, and that's going to be the counterbalance to the wizards, people will say, oh, the wizard has spell slots, they have a limitation to how much stuff they can do a day. Meanwhile, the strong man can just go on a warpath all day. How do you balance this? Obviously, you just add stamina. Well, at least that's the first thing I think of when it comes to a problem like that, because if we're trying to go for a more realistic foundation, why not just add stamina? That's the most realistic thing you could do.
Yeah.
And then you can do interesting things like, oh, I want to exert myself so I can do this crazy feat. Okay, that's just going to cost you more stamina and you're going to be more tired at the end of the day. And then you could keep adding on to this and make it unique and interesting so that even though they're not a spellcaster, they can still make very unique and interesting decisions with their pool of stamina that they have to them.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. I yeah, I think that's a great way of dealing with it, and yeah, I guess I would just leave it at that. I honestly think,
Yeah.
well, I guess I'll say this a little bit more. I think modern D&D has, I think that they're afraid to change anything, and I think maybe for good reason because I don't think fourth edition was really well received, and I don't know that they have. So some of the issues with modern Dungeons and Dragons, and even older versions or what have you, are basic, maybe not basic. Maybe that's unfair. I would say a lot of them are basic now because game development has changed over time. We've gotten a lot better at it, just like we've got better at everything else, right? So we're not we're not throwing stones at Gary Gygax by saying that D&D first edition wasn't perfect, right? I don't think that's a you know. Hopefully nobody feels that way about anything, but that it's perfect or what have you. But modern D&D, the way that spells work is just problematic, and some of the things, the way these various systems interact, just will they're on the surface. Some systems should be changed. Now you could change it a lot of different ways. I think what you're suggesting sounds like a great idea for having stamina as a pool for those who want a reference for that. I mean, obviously, like characters historically have had pools of points. You could treat it like sorcerer. Sorcerers having points to spend to modify spells, what have you. So there are something that's similar. I think that in general, though, like D&D, they know if they change too much, some amount of people will not like it and will go to a different system. And so, it's kind of like nobody ever gets fired from their job losing money on Exxon. This is a statement from finance, but like, here's a company who sells oil. The world needs oil. If Exxon goes down, who would have known? But if you do something risky and you try to do something novel, then, and this happens in digital gaming, guys, with companies that are far larger than D&D is, but they're very risk averse because of this. And so, the people making the financial decisions have no idea if the creative people are off base, or if they're on the right path, or what have you. And so they're typically very risk averse, and they don't want to change things up more than they absolutely have to, which is why they want to make a new version of D&D so that they can sell you more products and new products and you have to buy them. But at the same time, they don't want to change it so much that it feels like it's changing it all, because then some amount of people will leave. And so that's the business side of this. Real quick, GDS has, not real quick, but GDS has some stuff here, some interesting comments for us. So I'm going to reread part of this. So one application is that strength is often a prerequisite for speed and athletic movement, which we already read. But for example, martial arts, getting stronger also makes you faster, unless you really overdo it. Maybe you can divide overloaded dexterity into gross movements and fine movements. Cool. And then, and then he says, right, I'd say the difference in your character can be oh my gosh, I can't read. I'd say the difference in your character can be exception to statistics, and not exceptions to the rules of the world. For example, physics. At least in my game, it's subjective. Does your guest have a channel? Yeah, Gurius, I don't think you have a channel, do you, man?
I don't, but I've been thinking of making one with a friend of mine, and I'll shamelessly plug that when I make it. But
Okay, perfect. Cool, cool, cool.
yeah,
Then he
but
says, oh,
oh
sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
no, 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 continue, continue.
Uh,
This is I was yeah.
Yeah. Also, they don't want to change too much because this is in reference to what we just said. Also, they don't want to change too much because they paid to buy the game. They don't want to throw away the recognition value. Yeah, that's fair.
Exactly. Like like if I were a business, right? If I were a corporation or a business, I can't fault them, because that, like, if their sole goal is to make money, that's the best way to do it. That is the safest way to do it. That's for sure. But I don't enjoy the D&D experience anymore, and I am in a lucky enough position where I can try my luck at trying to make my own system, because when it comes to the argument, I know you've mentioned it before, where, oh, we're simplifying things down so that, people, it's easier. I think, for the sake of trying to play the game and really make this perfect fantasy character that has accurate strength or what have you, if a game is complex because of that, and the players really want to, achieve that fantasy, they'll play it. They'll pull out the calculators, and they'll do what needs to be done. All right, there is an audience out there. I'm sure of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think GURPS is part of that audience, and there are a handful
Exactly.
of other systems. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm actually very interested in a. Um, I am interested in a couple things. One is a system that will start off easy, and that is there is a clear way to transition into a more complex system. And that's actually something that I have been working on with some friends for longer than the OGL has been going on. Let's just say that before that.
Wow.
So that's something that I'm really interested in, and one day would love to do. I know that a lot of us, I know GDS here has talked about. I know that he's talked about creating mechanics in TTRPGs, to know that he's thought about this stuff a lot, and it seems like you have too. So hopefully in the future we will have more products and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, we all just want everybody to have fun and share in the hobby. And there being multiple systems, there being more stuff in the ecosystem is only it's only good for everybody, right? I think if you like one particular piece of content and somebody else, a different system is doing well, it's going to lead to rising tide lifts all boats. And I think that's really the case in TTRPGs. And I think there's still a lot of growth in this market, which is why someone like Hasbro is so interested in it, because they do see that growth potential.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have the biggest share of the pie right now,
Yeah.
at least, yeah. So, if I was Hasbro, I'd, keep my share as big as possible and try not to shrink it. And the only way, the safest way to do that is not changing things
Yeah,
or
yeah.
slightly changing things.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you dropping in, Grizz, and appreciate everybody who dropping comments. Shield, GDS, Nani, Lyriel. It's Shot if you're still here. Appreciate all of you guys dropping in. We will. I think we're going to keep doing live stream, guys. Some of the products that I've reviewed recently, I'm going to reach out and see if we can have some of the folks that made some of these products because, again, I just really enjoy games. I enjoy talking with fellow nerds who also like games, who make games, and that's what we're going to try to do more of. I think we might try to aim for it on Fridays, but we'll just have to see. So keep an eye out. And I love having the conversations here because one of the things I feel is like there are a lot of people that have homebrewed a lot of stuff. And so there are a lot of people that have really great ideas that are maybe even better than what's published out there. And sure, they might not, it might be you and you might not be putting it into a full, package or whatever, but it's still fun and interesting to talk about. And homebrewing is obviously what we're all about on the channel. For those of you guys who don't know, we did reach 1,000 subs. Woo! So we are monetized now. If you want to become a channel member, it's the best way to support the channel. Can start for as little as $1 a month, and that just allows me to continue to make more videos. But I think we'll call the live stream here for today. Again, Grizz and everybody else who joined in chat, I appreciate all of you guys being here, and we will see you in the next one, guys. I appreciate it, and hope you have a good evening.
Have a good night, everyone.
Cool, we're out, man.